Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a very important topic, given the number of horrific events we've seen in the past few years alone, where mosques have become the targets of violent hate crimes. And in the past 2 decades, there have been hundreds of documented cases of vandalism, arson, hate mail, shootings, and bombings of mosques in Western countries. We have, for example, the deadly 2017 Quebec mosque massacre and the 2019 horrific attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Muslims in Western countries have increasingly found their places of worship under threat. Campaigns of intimidation and harassment are not limited to far-right individuals and groups. We also want to point out that governments too have played a role in targeting mosques. Following 9/11 in the US, law enforcement, including the FBI, carried out covert illegal surveillance operations at mosques, using informants to entrap Muslims. And additionally, over the last 2 decades, French authorities have taken aim at indiscriminately shutting down mosques, resulting in severely impacting French Muslims' right to freely practice their religion. Today, we'll be speaking with our international panel of experts as we discuss how mosques and Islamic organizations in Australia, New Zealand, and the US are dealing with the growing threats of violence and the impact all of this is having on Muslim communities around the world. So I'll begin by briefly introducing our panelists, and we'll have a 20-minute presentation from each of them, and then we'll head into an audience Q&A. So be sure to use the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions. Our first panelist will be Dr. Derya Inur, who is a senior lecturer and research coordinator at the Center for Islamic Studies at Charles Sturt University. Her research focuses on Islamophobia in Australia, women and children's experience with Islamophobia, mosque attacks, and hate-motivated vandalism at Islamic institutions. Inur is the chief investigator of the Islamophobia in Australia reports 1, 2, and 3, which drew worldwide attention in the first few weeks of their release by potentially reaching over 930 million international audiences. The reports were also instrumental in introducing the religious discrimination bill to Parliament. Dr. Inur's research reports and report collection mechanism inspired other target communities to develop third-party reporting and research reports. She serves as the director of Islamophobia Register Australia. Our second panelist is Aliyah Denzayson. She is the national coordinator of the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand and previously served in various roles for the organization, including leading its government engagement for the last 8 years. A recognized advocate for diversity and inclusion, Aliyah has extensive experience in law, education, community development, and successful youth engagement. Aliyah found a youth program for Muslim females identified as best practices in New Zealand and internationally. She has participated in 5 global summits, has twice been a finalist for the New Zealand Women of Influence Awards in Diversity and Public Policy. She runs a consultancy business focusing on culturally responsive approaches, youth development, and leadership. And our final panelist is Thalia Mogahed, who is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Mogahed is a former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. With Dr. John Esposito, who is the director of The.Bridge.Initiative, she co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Barack Obama appointed Mogahed to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. Her 2016 TED Talk was named one of the top TED Talks that year, and she's a frequent commentator in global media outlets and international forums. And now I'm going to hand over to our first panelist, Dr. Derya Inur, who will be speaking for about 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon, America. Good morning, New Zealand and Australia. And thank you for inviting me to talk about this very important topic. Actually, mosque incidents are coming here and there, and it's important and timely to discuss this matter. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of Darug people where I work and live, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also would like to share my screen to take you through some points I want to share with you today. I will talk today about the three components of mosque attacks. Mosque attacks in general and in specifically in Australia, our report findings, and some issues about reporting and handling these cases and the impact and consequences of this. Firstly, as everyone knows, Islamophobia is a form of anti-Muslim racism, and mosque attacks is a form of Islamophobia. And the problem here is really the same rhetoric used for visible Muslims. As you know, Muslim women are the brunt of Islamophobia. And similarly, mosques are the brunt of Islamophobia because they're both visible. And the language is very much similar. The rhetoric is very similar, which is women are cultural, demographic, and security threats. And very much similarly used, this rhetoric is used for mosques as well. The problem here is we see a very much overlap between the everyday rhetoric and the far-right extremist rhetoric. So when it is great replacement theory in the jargon of far-right extremism, in the everyday rhetoric, it is simply anti-mosque campaigns, but the component is very much similar. So it is a cultural threat because it seems like it is outlandish. Remember 2009 Switzerland ban minarets referendum. Most of people said no minarets in Switzerland, or Ground Zero Mosque campaign in America. And interestingly, emotional triggers to connect it with 9/11, and some people even said it is not respectful to the victims of 9/11. So these combinations in the, I think, public rhetoric made majority of people biased about mosques and building of mosques. And this was very similar in other countries, in Britain, in Australia, like ban the Bendigo Mosque campaign, so massive campaigns. And these campaigns, sometimes when there is a poll or opinion, you know, kind of survey, we see that people are distant to mosque because seeing it as outlandish, as it's a culturally contaminating the Australian land or the Western land and not belonged, and demographic because it means a community is living around, and that is uncomfortable, and seeing it as security threats because the common rhetoric is these are the hubs of extremism. And the problem here is under the great replacement theory and far-right extremists are using very similar language. When we look at the manifesto of the terrorist Taran from Christchurch, he is also making very much similar points. He says, empty chairs and full mosques, demographic threat. And he says, he sees mosque as a symbol of invasion, a landmark of Islam. That's why he says we will walk to Constantinople and we will destroy every mosque and minaret, and we will free Hagia Sophia from minarets. So minarets and mosques are, I think, a symbol of invasion. Also, when he explains in his manifesto why he chose Christchurch, he says there were more invaders inside, and also it has a history of extremism. Here, the problem is the overlap between everyday opinions and rhetoric infused into everyday language, and the same rhetoric similarly shared by extremist people who are planning to or attack Muslims and mosques. This brings two problems. One is great replacement theory is becoming an everyday language, and far-right populist ideas are finding better ground, but also Islamophobia is turning into, and sometimes mosque as an element of Islamophobia, becoming a really good hook for far-right extremists to recruit members to their cause. So radicalization starts, gradually, and this is a very fertile ground to, recruit people to their cause, and that is concerning. So Islamophobia is a social cohesion problem, or sometimes it's taken as Muslims' problem. But at the end of the day, the Quebec, Christchurch, and many other attacks or attack attempts show that Islamophobia kills as well. So I also want to take you to another problem. This is handling of hate crimes and hate attacks. When there is no clear manifesto or identification of Islamophobic speech at the damage, it is sometimes taken simply as property damage. So smashing a mosque's windows or similar things are taken as property damage. Sometimes the hate component is not recognized simply because no one left a note about Muslims. However, running in your car into a mosque, or throwing bottles or doing things damaging is not purely property damage, and that is a policing matter and poor handling of the case. Although it is targeting mosques, the hate component is sometimes not recognized. And another thing is, now when we are moving to inciting violence, sometimes it's taken very lightly when we see social media here and there, and everyone knows around the world after Christchurch, it was horrible. People were inciting violence, celebrating Christchurch attack, and people were promising to start similar, movements and civil war in Australia, in different countries as well. When we look at Islamophobia reports in different countries, we will see very similar language. But what happened afterwards? Nothing is taken seriously. And that's why, not seeing the consequences, this type of rhetoric is very commonly used in social media platforms that are used by everyone. And this is inciting violence, obviously leading to terrorist attacks. But even after terrorist attacks, or sometimes terrorist attack attempts, we don't see serious measures are taken. And in addition to that, we also see mosque attendees are intimidated, or sometimes attempts to kill them as well. So this is a serious issue, but it's not taken mostly under the terrorism law, even sometimes even not taken as a hate crime, and seeing them simply as a property damage was a big ignorance. But at the end of the day, beginning from the low level to a high level violence and attack, the impact was very similar for the Muslim community, because after Christchurch, similar attempts were taken in Australia as well. And people reporting these cases to Islamophobia register were putting notes like, trauma is triggered. It is again. So the impact is big. That's why they should be taken seriously. Another problem is that because we are hearing all these cases as anecdotal attacks here and there, we really don't, we can't draw the, we can't kind of draw a full picture, because we can't connect the dots. So we don't know if it's an everyday racism, or if it's motivated by far right, or it's something else. So that needs to be known, but first it needs to be taken seriously to make a difference. So after Christchurch, we saw a resurgence, even before Christchurch, because the resurgence of far right was quite instrumental in the increase of attacks targeting mosques. In Sweden, look at 2016, 60% of mosques were attacked. In Australia, this was a report came to us, and it was in our earlier Islamophobia report. I just put it obviously before Christchurch, and this guy was talking on a radio, and the reporter is saying that everyone knows him, his street address, and his Facebook address. And this guy on the radio was saying he wants to firebomb the mosque at Arundel. He's giving the address in Brisbane with all the mosques trapped in it. So this rhetoric is neither new nor rare. That was here and there, always around, floating around, but not taken seriously. Even after Christchurch today, we have the same problem. It's not taken seriously. That's why you can't see any serious attempt to change this rhetoric or this trend. So, and this hate speech is very common from this person. And assume the Arundel Mosque people, attendees, and the risk they feel day to day when they are visiting the mosque. And in Canada, it was Quebec killing, as Mubashara mentioned, with 6 Muslims, but the attacker, the terrorist, believed that people inside were terrorists, and he was regretful for not killing more people. And in Germany in 2019, 70 mosques were attacked. And in New Zealand, as you know, people died, more than 50 people, and copycat attacks increased, and the violent extremist, I think, ideas spread more. But the problem was, even the anti-mosque Facebook groups, you know, all social media groups, or whoever demonized mosques, said any word after the Christchurch. In contrast, whenever an ISIS bomb happens, every single Muslim was expected to apologize and differentiate themselves from the attacks. So we don't see that happen. Even those who are openly demonizing mosques were not expected to, you know, say any apology word. And these people even didn't distance themselves from what happened. We watched some Facebook media, Facebook pages, and looking at their rhetoric before, during, and after the Christchurch, still nothing changed. It's simply because no pressure on them, no legal pressure, no social pressure. So they continue as they used to do, and that's a big problem. And look at some cases from Australia. As you will see that the first one was from Australia, Brisbane, and it was in the 20th anniversary of Christchurch, and the terrorist was glorified as saint, and remove kebab, as you know, was the term inscribed in the terrorist gun. So, and that was in the same year. And you can see the door of the mosque was similarly damaged, and with I think neo-Nazi symbols. And the Islamic Center in Canberra, again, September 2019, was burned. And you still see, and the last picture is from an Islamic center, and it is from that was happening in April. Again, and I know I see in different countries here and there things are happening, but nothing has changed. So looking at this Christchurch, we ran a pilot study in Australia and looked at the mosque across Australia. We found the survey was taken around 78 mosques. Oh, sorry, 75 mosques. And we found that between 2014 and 19, 58% of the mosques had some form of attack, received some form of attack, and almost 30% were taken in 2019. And we see some form of opposition to mosques as well, 44% formal, 22 informal, 11% media, 13% online, and 10% other. So that is the common culture, and the other is the consequence of that common culture of demonizing mosques. And attacks varied, it can be graffiti, arson, and even some mosques had multiple, sometimes 6 times, and also vandalizing for some mosques 3 to 4 times. And repeat attacks for a community is a very big traumatizing, I think, impact. So in short, attacks varied, and we couldn't really see a really good combination about whether they're taking place in Anglo-dominated or multicultural places. We really don't know. It happens everywhere in mostly residential areas. However, we found that the older is the mosque, the greater likelihood of attack, or the more visible is the mosque, the greater likelihood of attack. So visible through media or online media, which means either the mosque itself is visible or the anti-Muslim anti-mosque campaigns are visible. Interestingly, when we see, okay, what is the connection between online and attacks? Again, look at the terrorist Taran's manifesto. He gives a lot of Facebook, and many other online links in his manifesto, but he says he was initially deciding to, he decided to attack another mosque, but after watching one mosque video, one community's video, he decided to direct his attack to Christchurch. So a video on social media made him decide choose Christchurch. So there is a connection, but again, lacking research, we can't see that direct connection, and that needs to be taken. And the irresponsible, I think, social media attempts to demonize mosques should be, I think, seized. So I will introduce you another layer of problem. One is, yes, everyday language and extremism very much overlapping. The other is handling of the issue. And the third is mosques themselves. They don't report. There are ambiguities. People are not trained enough. So when you call them mosque attack, they're expecting a bomb or arson. So they don't take hate email as an attack. So minor incidents are not taken as any attack. So we need to train the Muslim community. Another thing is silence, knowing that visibility brings more problem from outside, attracting attacks from outside, and also causing anxiety and trauma within the community. So mosque admins prefer to stay silent, even they don't share it with their own colleagues in the mosque because of that, they don't want to open the Pandora box. Or they prefer avoidance behavior, although it can be helpful to stop the problem, it doesn't solve it. So there was a center in Victoria, and because women were continuously harassed after Christchurch, every day going to work, so they decided to send women to work from home. That's not a solution. That is just an avoidance behavior, and it doesn't bring any solution. So avoidance doesn't bring solution. Another matter is trust issue. When we were conducting the research, we found people don't want to disclose their names. They don't want to disclose their mosque details because they don't want to be visible. And also remember, after 9/11, mosques were under surveillance, and people don't know who is taking our details, for what reasons. Again, we did this also a survey 2019 and also 2020. So 2020, sorry, because we looked at 2014 and 2019. So 2020 was the kickoff COVID-19, and mosques were still, kind of problematized as if the places of spreading germs and people still coming in congregation. That's why they didn't want to disclose their details. It's a trust issue. They don't trust in researchers, government, and they don't know who is taking their details. So that is a problem needs to be, I think, fixed. And as a result, helplessly, they're helpless. So the best means of self-protection from, for example, Western Australia, when we say, well, how do you protect yourselves? Some brothers walking around to ensure safety. Although there were some safety grants by the government, it was simply, I think, hiring safeguards or instilling security cameras, but it should be more than that. So Jewish community is using swipe cards, but Muslims don't want it because they don't want to be identified. Who is taking all these details? So there are layers of problems that needs to be addressed in a sophisticated way. Another thing, when we were talking to imams, any incident, they were saying, no, we are a good Muslim, good citizens, and we are getting a lot of support from our community. They don't want to be seen as a problem and source of problem. And all these are, I think, some pressures on Muslims, and some imams coming from overseas don't know their rights. They don't want to deal with police. They're scared of police intervention.
Aliyah, we will move on to you now to talk about the impact on communities in New Zealand.
Thank you. Kia tote rangi marie, assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you and upon the world. Today I'm going to speak on the immediate and lasting impact of and consequences of the mosque attacks in Christchurch, and the impact that it's had on the New Zealand Muslim community, but also on our whole nation. But first, before I say that, New Zealand, while it is considered part of the West, it is not a Western nation. It is actually a Pacific nation. And that location and the indigenous population, we have a significant indigenous population with Maori of over 15% of our population is indigenous, and that has had both a protective factor and has supported us and has helped us in our challenges that we are facing due to, first, the location, but also the indigenous population being here and having been huge advocates for their own community, and now have stood alongside us as we've addressed the consequences of terror in our mosques. Also, we are a Western nation in the sense that we were colonized by the British, and that also those structures that you will see in Western countries exist here, including within our government. But still, things are, and I think the world saw it immediately after the attacks, as we were addressing the immediate impact. The world saw that things were done differently in New Zealand, and that has brought benefits, but it has also brought attention and some focus from unwanted parties as well. And so there are those unique consequences. And what you should know about the New Zealand Muslim community is that we are a relatively new population. While we have had people living here for over 150 years from the Muslim community, we have only had a significant communities of Muslims developing over the last 30 to 40 years. And so we are relatively new in comparison to the other countries we're discussing today. So with the impact of the terrorist attack, what I would say for the Muslim community, if I were to do an analogy, it would be like walking, we as a community, as an individual that surprisingly walked into darkness, and how you have difficulty seeing and assessing initially, and then you have to adjust your view and your vision of what's going on. And we had to adjust who we are as a nation from the Christchurch terrorist attack. And that while we had concerns prior to, for our community, we had, in comparison to our Muslim brotherhood around the world, we had felt significantly more safe in New Zealand in comparison. And so when the attacks arrived, we had a huge blow because of it. But still, prior to the attacks, we had been living relatively comfortably, but the security and government itself had seen us as the sole risk, or the focus, and that was a finding out of our Royal Commission since the attacks, that the security agencies were focused basically solely on the Muslim community. We had felt that. We had been advocating that we were not the risk, but that we were seeing risks within the community. And in particular, the female Muslim community had been advocating because we had been seeing harassment, both online, but also in person. And there were concerns for our own physical safety. We did not see an attack on the scale that Christchurch happened, but we had expressed risks and concerns for our safety, and were seeking support for that, and had not been able to shift the security agencies at that time. And so basically the security that in New Zealand, we're not looking for any other threats other than outside or inside of the Muslim community, and we were dismissed. And so that was doubly devastating when the attack happened, because we had been working to try and get support, but didn't have that support. And our security agencies were not prepared and didn't know how big the actual risk was that was actually within our borders. So when the attack happened, to know we are only 65,000 Muslims in New Zealand. And so it was a huge attack on a small community within a very small nation of only 5 million. But yet it was on the global stage because it was live streamed, and it was allowed to, the video was allowed to keep being kicked, and people downloaded the video and have kept it. It is illegal to hold the video in New Zealand or to show it, and as well the manifesto that he wrote. However, around the world, it is regularly shared still today. But so that event was a global event, but in our small mosques. And it had a huge blowback. 10% of the population of the Muslim population of Christchurch was in the mosque that day. 1 in 2 of the Muslim community in Christchurch knew or was related to somebody who lost their lives or was bullet wounded on the day. The whole community had a huge devastation to it. So that immediate impact had a disruption to the leadership in Christchurch. For example, the hardworking community that we had in their community-oriented leaders, most of them were killed in the mosque themselves. We lost male and female leaders of the community in that day. And what happened is the rest of the Muslim community had to rally around. And so we had a nation immediately, not just the nation, but the Muslim community in particular, to help navigate where you have a whole community that's devastated to that extent. Normally when someone loses 1 person or 2 people, the community comes around, and it had to mobilize from around the nation to do so. That has done a depletion of resources for the nation as well. Many of us were dealing with the fact that we had always felt safe in our mosques, and we realized that we were vulnerable. And just like we were blown into darkness, so were the authorities. And we knew and were able to see, and the authorities themselves acknowledged that they did not know the scale of the risk that we were actually at. So we were walking blind together, and we had to walk blind with our authorities, and to get the support around, to get our community buried, to even economic and financial. We had to work with the authorities that we considered as a community let us down. If I were to take something from that experience up to the immediate impact, is I feel every single mosque, every single religious community, every community should have plans now. And it's unfortunate to say it, but we should have plans in place. Just like we do risk assessments for trips, we need to do risk assessments for terrorism, and we need to plan and have contingency plans in place. We did not, as a community, do that before the attacks, but we do now. Subsequent to the attacks, lots of resources and time of community had to be immediately directed to Christchurch and the victims. And and that was about time. And we were already time depleted because we were small. And those resources had to be put into stabilizing the community, but also to find out what went wrong. Why didn't the authorities? There was actually a global terrorism training event occurring in Christchurch on that day. And they did not stop the terrorists. They didn't see the terrorists coming. And that's what's ironic in there. And so if you want to know the full facts about what happened there on the day, please read the Royal Commission submission. And you can get a full, our submission, but also to get the findings of the Royal Commission will tell you the full. But it had a huge emotional impact, physical impact, financial impact, spiritual impact. And it required a significant amount of emotional resources to address it as a result. So once that immediate stabilization happened in the first 7 to 10 days, where you would have seen, we had global media across the board. We had to bring in every corner to come in and get through the process that we had. We had government on the ground throughout. It was just the stabilization. But when that immediately after that, we had to go into finding out what went wrong, which was the Royal Commission. And the government appointed 2 people, a judge and somebody from the public service, both highly respected, to run an inquiry into what went wrong. And so the leadership of our community also had to go into that to find out what actually happened. But that process was quite highly traumatic and highly draining on many levels as well, because we were allowed to present evidence, but we were not allowed to hear evidence in the Royal Commission because of security. We were told we were not allowed to be there, and no Muslims sat in and heard the evidence. And so we had to rely on the findings of people without being present. And so that has caused concerns still. We also have to, we had to make a decision on balancing our security and our privacy at the time. We needed to be secure. So our mosques had police in them. We have since had to, we have 24/7 surveillance on all our mosques now, or our main mosques across the nation. And unobstructed, previously we had unobstructed access to our mosque. We could walk in at any time. Travelers could come in and stay. And now they're secured. And we now have fobs to get into our mosques. And we can only get into them at certain points. And that has had an impact. The other thing is, how do people, we had to navigate, how do you assess the risks that are out there, especially when they're unknown, and some of them, like, especially that exist online. So a lot of the threats that we get come from online. And the question for us, a lot of them actually come from overseas. We don't know where they're located. And so are they located in are they my neighbor, or are they overseas? And our agencies have been trying to get around that, and it's a challenge. And so some of us even have personal protection plans as a result, because the security cannot fully assess the risk. So we function in that new world. We have observed vulnerabilities. Now, since the attacks, we've been able to find out, for example, New Zealand has per capita, we're the highest posters. Well, when you look at the numbers, just straight numbers, you go, oh, those are really small numbers. But when you look at it per capita, we have higher posters to 4chan than any other nation in the world. We are right behind the US in right-wing extremists per capita. And so it's a small nation, but that hadn't even been seen by our authorities before. So when our authorities are saying they're getting around it, there is a question that we have doubts about some of our people that were in there. Are they fully around it now? Now, the vulnerabilities, we know that our buildings are identifiable, but also that many of us in the community are identifiable by our dress. We know that the ethnic minorities also are at risk and are being targeted, including our Tangata Whenua, the indigenous people of our land. not all the risks are perceivable. We know that there are copycats. We know that there are right-wing extremist groups. We know that there's different disinformation out there. And we know that daily social media is showing us more and it's evolving. So we know we are vulnerable. So it makes people concerned. And while we have not had a well-designed study, we do know that there's a noticeable reduction in women's attendance to our mosques since the attacks. We know that people have modified their day-to-day activities. And we know that many female youth have reported a fear of traveling alone and using public transport as well. The impact that we've done for our community, there's a financial due to the mosque modifications. The government has contributed to that, but that has taken a toll on us. We've changed our behavior. Visitors, where we're supposed to welcome culturally our visitors, we now naturally suspect more, and their visitors are more highly scrutinized and not as warmly welcomed because of that natural fear that is there now. We are far more security conscious. So when we do trips for our youth, we now have security calculated. Police are informed. We have drive-bys going by our events. When I am designing visits for a retreat that we have had to design a plan to tell our people how to run a tree line to get to safety in case something happens. And so when you're telling someone they're coming to a retreat, but then you have to debrief them on where they have to run for security in case, it's not a very relaxing, and that's a consequence for our events. And so there's been an impact on our well-being, and it's physical, emotional, spiritual, and financial. But who are we as Kiwi Muslims? We're trying to maintain that social cohesion that the world saw immediately after the attacks. It existed here. It's unique here. And I think the world has a lot to learn from that cohesion. So when I hear Dr. Inner talking about the Australian experience, and I can tell you, when I've traveled there, I've experienced it as well. While there are people in New Zealand that express hate to us, there is a vast majority of people who are embracing us as a community that we and stand alongside us. And that's something that has come out of Christchurch that has been very positive. And while we are hearing the high voices of people talking and raising their voice in hatred, there are few in number. And we just need to be assured that the government are around those people, and we are feeling far more confident of that because of the advocacy then, and also the statistics that we are seeing within our own community. The advocacy that our Muslim community has had to do inside, both publicly and with our government, has consequences, and we realize that. So financially, while we've had to put resources to advocacy inside of our community, that means that that's less community development that we can put forward. So there can be long-term consequences if we don't counter that. And we were already a depleted leadership in the sense of dealing with the consequences of what was going on prior to the attacks. And so our leadership is very depleted since because of it. And the meager resources that we have are going to lawyers and professionals for advocacy often, and we are doing things on a thread for community development. And so we are trying to get back to that, but we need assurances that our government is around all of the rest. Now, New Zealand Muslims are not unique in the fact that many of our community have already experienced trauma before coming to New Zealand. They experienced trauma since New Zealand because of the attacks. And then we had COVID on top of it. So we are experiencing higher mental health trauma as a result. We are still experiencing the dehumanization online. We are in the middle, and as soon as I leave this, literally as soon as I leave this, I'm heading into a coronial inquest hearing for a coronial inquest, and social media is included in that coronial, and we want to know exactly what happened and what went before the terrorist, and did it have a impact on what he did. We also are impacted by subsequent events. So Buffalo, Uvalde, when those happen and you hear what's happening to the families, it's exactly, like during the event, it was very similar to what happened to our community. So it has a consequence when those events happen. We have a loss of confidence in systems, and we have a loss of, we don't want our youth to develop what we would call a victimhood situation. And we don't want intergenerational trauma occurring and ongoing from this. So we're a bit thrown, but we're on the fly learning how to deal with it and navigate it. And we are trying to step into that space and make it safe for our community. Now, there are 3 points that I would like for everyone who's listening to get, and then I'll leave you with that and then can answer questions later. Specific to the Christchurch attacks, our mosques were attacked. They were the places of worship and venues where we would seek solace and peace, and they were our sanctuary. How does one resolve that? And where do we go for peace now? We have to have a secure space to do so. The next thing is terrorism due to Islamophobia. The faith which Muslims find strength with is identified as the reason that we were targeted. So we have to process that. And it makes us more vulnerable and at risk. And this is a spiritual and emotional challenge that we are navigating. And we are being placed, and in a spiritual form, we are and I think our community's done really well in understanding the concept of putting your trust in Allah or putting your trust in God. At some point, you have to trust, and that's what we are doing. And then finally, attacks and response. The impact of unity on the Muslim community and with the Muslim community was extremely helpful at the time of the attacks that we needed. The nation came around us. And while in Australia, people perhaps were shouting at Muslims at the time of the attack after Christchurch, for us, they embraced us. The vast majority of community embraced us. But that beautiful response has also made it a challenge for us to fully advocate, because we know that we have social cohesion here, and we know we are benefiting from that, and we don't want to impact that, but we also want our same rights and safety that every other New Zealander has. And so we have to advocate, and we have a balance that we go through. So those are the 3 things to think about related to the attacks. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah. That was a very, very important presentation. So thank you for that. We will move on to the last panelist, Dalia Mogahed, who will be talking about the US.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. Peace be upon you. Before I jump into my presentation, I just want to say thank you so much to the previous 2 panelists, especially Sister Alia, who touched upon an incident and a phenomena that really sent ripples through the entire world. And the people of New Zealand and the Muslim community of New Zealand have been in our prayers ever since. So we really stand in solidarity with you, and we stand in admiration for your resilience. I can't express how shocked. And you talk about trauma, subhanAllah, it's I can't imagine the trauma the community has been dealing with since then. I'm going to be presenting on the United States, and I'm going to be widening the lens a bit to looking at public opinion and Islamophobia and how the 2 relate, how public opinion creates the ecosystem in which these kinds of attacks can happen. But also, it also produces the suitable political climate for the government to both ignore certain kinds of extremism, but also be, in some cases, the perpetrator of violence against Muslim communities in the form of state violence, surveillance, entrapment, and so forth.
Thank you so much, Dalia. Thank you to each of our panelists for their wonderful presentations. We have a couple of questions. So the first one we have is from Ismail Alberk. I think this is open to anyone who wants to answer. Are these attacks from far-right people only, or are there also some other religious communities or members? So I'm assuming attacks or targeted crimes against mosques, are they only being carried out by individuals from the far right, or are there other groups that are have been playing a role? Dr. Nar?
Maybe, yeah, thank you very much. It's a very relevant question to remember other attacks as well. That really completes the whole picture. The literature shows that in the West, Sikh temples were also targeted, assuming that they're mosques. There are cases like that, but also, especially synagogues are targeted. But as in Australia, when the far-right extremist leaders, when we were talking to each other on Facebook, actually that was captured by a Jewish activist in Australia. They were saying, let's focus on Muslims. Our next target is Jews, but now the weakest, starting with the weakest is the best strategy. Having this said, that synagogues in Australia is very well organized, and they are doing self-protection very well, to the extent that race discrimination commissioners visiting synagogue was telling he was, when he was gone through the security check, and his car was kind of checked again. So there are the swipe cars they're using for their community. So it is very well established. But for Muslim community, the solution should come from inside, because you can't really, simply copy and paste answers that don't work for Muslims. But in the meantime, we need to also acknowledge that attacking worship places is a global problem. And in August, in Nigeria, in a Catholic church, 40 people died. And it is a very, I think, very bad and concerning form of terrorism. And why we are focusing on Muslims in the West? Because I think we should clear our house first, come up with a really strong democracy and measures, so that we can be helpful for other nations and guide them. When we are seeing erosion of democracy in our countries, and in proportional, I think, application of terrorism laws and many other issues and problems in-house, we are not in this status of really advising to the other countries. That's why I think it's important to first focus on fixing our problems. But in the meantime, we need to recognize other deadly forms of attacks directed at other communities. I suggested a comprehensive research, including criminology, policing, terrorism, racism, all together. They're working and co-designing a research together with Muslim communities. And these findings will be very applicable to other communities suffering from similar issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Aliyah, you also wanted to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to pop in there on in the New Zealand experience, the biggest risk right now, in our opinion, is from the right wing. However, it doesn't mean that there are not other risks. And we are by no means the only community. Just last night, for example, an LGBTQ person from the LGBTQ community had created an arts center, and it was painted pink, but it had previously been a church, and that venue was attacked, and the individuals were sentenced. the slogans that were placed on the church were definitely associated with Nazism and anti-religious. Also our marae are being targeted, and Tangata Whenua are being targeted from the right wing. So inside of New Zealand, the biggest threat right now is from the right wing. It is not, we're not saying it's the only threat, but it's by far the largest, and it's by data, and the government has the data and publicly available reports as well.
Thank you. Our next question's from Joan Buchanan. One of the biggest, if not endemic, forms of Islamophobia in New Zealand, I believe there are two forms. So one, the public service denial of Islamophobia, and two, their ignorance of Islam in the Muslim community, which further causes public servants to be very controlling of the democratic processes by limiting the participation of legitimate and sincere community advocates. This includes the New Zealand police. How can we counter this form of Islamophobia when even the RCOI don't make much difference?
So in New Zealand, I can say that we've had to, what happened was our security agencies were quite small, and therefore we're relying on international models and international direction, when in fact, and they've come to realize that actually internally they need to have more confidence in their own systems and their own self. But also we've been working alongside them to create further awareness. We'd been trying before, but now the door is wider open, and we are having those discussions. We are producing resources. We put resources even not just in public with our public servants, but also in our public schools. And that's been working alongside public servants to produce those resources. Primary, early childcare, all the way up through secondary at the moment. That we've done that, and so they're coming around, but it does exist. The other aspect, I know I saw the other question related to community, and what happened, because we are a small nation, the nation wanted to help. They wanted to help, and so often communities want to stand alongside us, or even at times think that they have the best solutions for the Muslim community, but as we are trying to develop our own community as well, we are happy to stand alongside, but it would be a bit of a colonial approach if other people came in and, superseded what we're trying to do but supporting us. We welcome all community groups to stand alongside us when we're addressing and moving forward, and that's been working quite effectively.
Thank you. So I'm gonna take moderator's discretion here and ask a question. I think this goes to each one of you from your perspective. So one of the things I've noticed from every person's presentation is the role of social media in inflaming Islamophobia, in spreading Islamophobia, but also showing that Islamophobia is not necessarily a localized phenomenon. It's interconnected, it's global. So what happens in one place, it has impacts or is connected to other places. So for example, with the Christchurch gunman, he had connections to far-right groups in Europe. He had come to Europe. He was connected to, he was also for the gunman in Quebec, he was following a lot of Trump's rhetoric. This was around the time of the 2016 election. When it comes to social media, from your perspectives, what role does that play in the promotion of Islamophobia in your countries? And where do you see that heading?
I'll step in the space first, and then I'm inside the Christchurch call, which was it's a goal to get in front of social media issues that are prevailing and in helping with support terrorism in a way. So there is effort being made, and there are good things that the social media are doing, and by no means you can see information being shared that help communities when they're being suppressed, in the sense of human rights and things. So there's really good aspects, but social media, just like newspapers, and this is my opinion, social media has a huge role in what has been happening. And they have in various communities around the world, not just in New Zealand. If we look at the Myanmar as an example, the Facebook has had a huge impact on community there. And those social media aspects social media needs to regulate its product and services, and they're not doing it adequately. So what do you do in that case? Then there are some forms of regulation, but what the line is related to privacy, what the line is related to human rights is something that we as a world and globally need to navigate, but also social media companies as good companies need to moderate and control their product. And at the moment, they're not doing a good enough job. And it's having consequences. Somebody from Russia, somebody from Sweden can impact my life here in New Zealand right now. And social media, for example, I have a threat that they can't find out where it's at. Google didn't want to tell the police, even the country that their user is based in. And as a result, my family has a personal protection plan. So it does have personal consequences. And Google, a multi-billion-dollar company, is not taking responsibility for something that it created on my life, and I didn't do something to Google.
Dr. Anar, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, yeah, there are really, I think, long-term impacts on people, because these are real people behind the screen, so it doesn't really change or reduce the fact that the threat is real. So after the Christchurch, we saw, for example, mass killing, civil war, let's start civil war and kill all Muslims type of rhetoric increased from 25% to 58%. And on social media, we were scaling the intensity of the hatred. It was very, I think, massive. And the pictures, people with guns and saying, let's start killing Muslims. And the other was saying, I'm pledging to kill every single day 10 Muslims in Australia. So they were in exuberance and celebration mode. But what happened? So this should be monitored by the police first. And these incidents were reported to hotline as well. So what are the consequences? We need to apply, again, these terrorism laws evenly. It shouldn't be only focusing on Muslim communities. Last week, there was an incident in Brisbane. A man with very far-right extremist rhetoric dropped a voice message, and he was promising to kill all Muslims, and it was in Krabi Mosque. And what happened was this man was released next day on a bail, and the community was very upset. So going back to the real and the online relationships, I think we need really social pressure. First, yes, legal measures are important, but in both cases, social pressures, because this type of language is lowering the public standards, and everyone is immune to hearing all these dehumanizing and inciting violence. And there is law in New South Wales about inciting violence is a crime, and people can go to jailing up to 3 years, get jailed up to 3 years. But we need to apply these laws in social media circumstances as well. So again, going back to the lowering standards in the public sphere and social media discourse, that is something I think people should really take roles. Although it can be not secure to jump into the discussion and have a kind of an argument with the perpetrator, I think reporting system to Facebook, Twitter, all these systems are important. I'm in the advisory board of Facebook, and we are discussing about how to increase the reports by the people and understand the community standards as well. Because AI technology cannot capture these, standards. People's sensitivity or the, I think laws in America may be different than in Australia, or the context matter, timing matter. So, and some images and the way they use the language very, I think, intricately to trigger hate cannot be captured by machine learning or AI technology. It should be human agency taking up roles, standing up and reporting continuously. If certain types of reports are going and telling that that's not acceptable, so it will be heard. So we need data, but the data is really about our upstanding, not just simply witnessing and absorbing and digesting. So we can't really push anyone without, I think, bystander movement, reporting and telling actively that we are not happy with these standards. It's very lower, just put it back to where it should be. And in real life circumstances as well, there was a question about if the need for security would interrupt social cohesion. And I would say the other way around. If there is a true social cohesion, if there is a social pressure on people, it will be preventative measure. People will not be really using this everyday language or far-right extremist rhetoric becoming everyday language. We will not allow it as a society, and that will be a preventative measure. That's why I think social pressure is very important, reporting is very important. Yeah, these are my overall answers.
The only thing I'll add to that is that when I've met with a company like Meta or Facebook, formerly Facebook, what they will always point to is that their community standards do have strict guidelines about posts that incite violence being taken down, posts that have racially or religiously hateful or racist language are taken down according to their current policies, which they've pointed to. And they also tell me that when you report a post, it is reviewed by a human being, not just a not just an algorithm. I think that where the challenge is that there are different standards of the definition of those things around the world. But the second thing is that you can create a post with a lot of misinformation that causes hatred without it qualifying as inciting violence directly, and or qualified as racial, a racial slur or something. So the users have figured out how to formulate content that will stay up and get around these policies. And what I've recommended, and I don't think it may never be implemented, but what I have recommended is that just as Facebook was putting content warnings on misinformation regarding COVID. So anytime you say, like, you write something that is incorrect about COVID, right? That it's, vaccines cause impotence or something. They'll actually, like, something will pop up that says, misinformation, you go to the CDC and learn more. So it's possible to do that. It's possible to actually have a redirection when there is something that is misinformation, starting a rumor that never, like Muslims were celebrating in New York City after 9/11, a complete fabrication. And yet it's being spread on social media. And so it's not a direct incitement to violence. It's not saying go kill Muslims, but it's definitely creating the emotional ecosystem by which that would happen. For something like that to actually have a misinformation label associated with it, exactly as you would against a vaccine. So that is one possibility to, as a measure to get around that, because they will repeatedly say our policies already are in place against incitement, direct incitement of violence, and direct prejudicial language. But there's a lot of nuance that can be used where hatred is incited without, falling under either of those definitions.
Yeah.
Thank you for this very, very informative session on a very heavy topic, but also a very timely topic. Thank you to each one of you. Thank you to everyone who tuned into this event. We will be publishing this on our website, so please be sure to check it out, bridge.georgetown.edu. Please follow our panelists on their social media and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to stay updated on the latest regarding Islamophobia around the world. And with that, thank you all. Have a great rest of your evening and a good morning to Australia and New Zealand. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.